starting today a new teaching series. If you've been with us for any amount of time, you'll know that usually at this point in the meeting, someone will get up and teach from the Bible, and we'll usually sort of work through a book of the Bible. And that'll mean that sort of each week we'll take a different section from that book and look at it and study it together and teach from it. But over these next 4 weeks, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. And that is that although all of the messages we're going to preach over these 4 weeks are going to be based on the Bible, we're not going to be looking at a specific book. But as Dave said, we're going to be looking at our values as a church. Going to be looking at the things that make us tick. Things that we're really passionate about and that we're really excited about. And so we've called this series The Heart of Life. We're looking at, what is it that is at the heart of Ascot Life Church? If you cut us open, what are the things that you'd see? And so we're really excited about this series. I think there's many reasons, good reasons for doing a series like this one. But one of the main ones for me relates to what Dave shared with us last week. You remember, Dave was sharing from his sabbatical, and he shared that we feel that as a church, God has got more for us to move into. We feel like God has got more people for us to reach with the good news about Jesus. We feel that God's got more groups for us to start around Ascot and Bracknell and wherever we are. And we feel that God may even be leading us to start new things in the future. We feel that God's got things for us to move forward into as a church. But we're aware that as we move forward together into those things, we don't want to lose who we are now. We don't want to lose what makes us Ascot Life Church. And so we thought it'd be good to just at the start of this year, take a few weeks to just look at what we're really excited about, what we're passionate about, and what we want to characterize us as ALC. And so today I'm going to be looking at particularly truth that we believe as Ascot Life Church. We're going to be looking at truth that makes us tick. And so this morning what I'm going to say isn't going to be particularly new to all of us. It will probably involve things that you've heard before, but it's important for us to remind ourselves of it because we want to keep this at the centre of our heart as we move forward into new things. And so we're going to be looking at truth, and I guess one of the primary truths that we believe as a church actually concerns this book that I hold in my hand, which is, by the way, the Bible, if you haven't already guessed. And we believe concerning the Bible as a church that it is not just any book. That it's not just another book written by humans which you can take or leave, but it's actually God's own word. It's God's way, his primary way of communicating with us as humans. And so, in that respect, it reveals truth to us. It reveals reality to us. It helps us make sense of life. When you read these words, you are reading words of God to you. And it reveals to you who God is, what this world's all about, and what we're all about. In fact, one of the main ways the Bible speaks about itself is as a lamp. Like a lamp which lights up the unknown or makes sense of confusion. That's what we believe about this book, that it helps us know truth, helps us know reality, and that's why on Sundays we will regularly preach from this book, and that's why when we meet up in small groups you want to read it together, and we encourage each other to read it on our own individually, because it reveals truth to us. It reveals how this world really is. That's what we believe about this book, but I'm aware that even in saying that, there may be some of us here who perhaps don't subscribe to that view. Perhaps you're here this morning and actually you'd be skeptical about whether the Bible is true. Maybe you'd be skeptical even about the Christian faith and whether God really exists. And if that's you, I would love to say firstly, you are still so welcome here with us as a church. You are very welcome here to come and investigate any questions you have with us. And in fact, if you do have questions, we'll be more than happy to talk about those with you. We're not afraid of questions here at Ascot Life Church. If you have them, we want to hear them and we want to help work through those with you. And I personally would be more than happy after this meeting to talk through any issues you have with the Bible or anything else I've said. We're happy to receive questions. We're happy for you to come here and investigate the Christian faith. You're welcome here. But the second thing I say to you, if you're skeptical about the Bible, is that really the best way to find out whether the Bible is actually true, the best way to find out whether this book is actually God's word, is to read it. Is to read it and see if it does what it claims to do. To read it and see if it does make sense of your life and if it does speak to you in your heart. There's a preacher from the Victorian era called Charles Spurgeon. And he was a famous preacher, often preached from the Bible. And he was once asked to defend the Bible. Someone said to him, can you sort of make a case for the Bible against all the accusations that people are levelling at it? And he said these words that have since become famous. He said, defend the Bible. I would as soon defend a lion. Simply let it out of its cage and it will defend itself. Now, I sort of feel like I should have read those words in like a Brian Blessed sort of voice, but hopefully you still sort of get what he's saying there. He's saying if you really want to find out if the Bible is true, yes, you can ask questions about it, yes, you can debate it, but the best way is just to let it loose and see if it doesn't sort of wreak some havoc in your heart and really speak to you. And so with sort of those words in mind, we're going to spend some time this morning looking at the Bible. We're going to spend some time looking at a specific passage from the Bible. And the passage I'm going to read in just a moment is from Ephesians 2, which is a letter in the New Testament. And the reason we've chosen this passage is because it very helpfully, I think, sums up the whole message of the Bible. And we're going to see two key things together as we work through this passage. Firstly, we're going to see who we are as humans without God, and then we're going to see what God has done for us. So I'm going to be reading from Ephesians 2, and just to start us off, we're just going to read the first 3 verses, and it will come up on the screen. There it is. So this is what it says in Ephesians 2. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. Now I'm going to stop there. Paul does go on to say more things, which you'll probably be glad to hear, but I wanted us to stop here because in these 3 verses, Paul sort of sums up the state of humanity as it is without God. He sums up who we were before God worked in our lives. And as you can see, he doesn't really pull any punches. Those words are actually, to me, really quite unpleasant to read, and I kind of want to read on from there, but I think it's good for us to look into them because though they're unpleasant, they are still true. And often the most unpleasant news to hear is often the news we most need to hear as well, isn't it? Just imagine for a moment that you were a doctor and you had 2 patients come to you with similar symptoms, and you said, okay, I'll look at your symptoms and I'll run some tests and then I'll call you and get back to you with what the results are. And you get back the symptoms for one of the patients, and it turns out that their symptoms are just the result of a common cold. And as long as they rest up and take it easy over the next few days, they'll be fine in a matter of days. They'll be fine by next week. But then you get the test results back for the other patient, and it turns out that their symptoms are the result of something far more serious, a condition which could actually be fatal if it's not treated. Now, in that situation, I don't think it's hard for any of us to know which patient we're going to call first, is it? We're going to call that second patient. And it's not because we like giving bad news or because we like saying unpleasant things, but it's because even though their news is unpleasant, it's far more important for them to hear it so that they can act on it. And I think that's sort of the same thing going on here. When the Bible says things that are on the face of it a bit unpleasant, it's not that the writers of the Bible sort of had no friends and like having a good moan at humanity. It's because the words they say we need to hear so that we can act on them. And that's true of all of us here. That's true of you if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian. I'd say actually these words are really important for you to hear. But it's also true if you're here this morning and you have met Jesus. You'll notice that Paul is actually writing this letter primarily to Christians. And he's saying, you also need to hear where you were without God. So we're going to spend just a few minutes digging into these verses. And the first thing I want us to see is that Paul sums up our state without God with this phrase in verse 1. He says, and you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you once walked. It says, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Now, those two words, trespass and sin, I'm aware are not words we often use today, but actually taken together, Paul uses them to describe the entirety of our failure to live as we should. And I'll explain how this is. So, trespass means to actively do something wrong. So, if I asked you to not punch me in the face this morning, as I often have to, and you went on and proceeded to punch me in the face anyway, what you would have done there is committed a trespass. You would have actively done something wrong. I asked you not to punch me, and you did it anyway. That's a trespass, okay? But the word sin kind of means the opposite of that. Sin means not so much actively doing something wrong, but failing to do what's right. Sin has the sense of missing the mark or, falling short of a standard. So take, for example, taxes. All of us, because we live in this country, or most of us, have a responsibility to pay our taxes. That is our duty as people living in England. But if we failed to do that, we wouldn't necessarily be actively doing something wrong against the government, but we would be falling short of a standard that's expected of us. That's what a sin is. So a trespass is doing something that's wrong. A sin, failing to do what's right. And Paul says these two words communicate how we so often live as humans. So often we fail to do the right thing and do the wrong thing instead. Paul says that's where we were without God. And he says actually that this way of living leads to actually a kind of death. Those words in verse 1 I find incredible. He says, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. It's a really striking way of speaking, isn't it? What on earth does Paul mean by saying that before you met God, you were dead? Now, I think we can safely say that what Paul doesn't mean is that before you met God, you had no physical life in you, or you had no sort of mental workings going on inside. We know that's not true. I often meet people who may not know Jesus, but they seem very much more alive than I am. I kind of come alive when I preach, but I tell you, if you saw me on a Monday morning on my day off, you would be checking to see if there was a pulse. I'm not always the most lively of people to be around, but that's not what Paul's saying here. He's not saying that you were sort of physically or mentally dead before you met Jesus. But what he is saying is this. He's saying that in the area of your life where it mattered most, i.e. in your spiritual life, in your relationship with God, in that area of your life, you were dead. There was no life in you. You had no awareness of your Creator. You had no awareness of God. And actually you had no desire for him either. Because you were so caught up, as Paul says, in your sin and in following the course of this world, He says, because you were so caught up in that, when it came to God, you were as responsive as a corpse. Don't know if you've ever tried talking to a dead thing. They don't respond very well, do they? And Paul says that's how you were towards God. You just had no awareness of him, no desire to know him. And I think, as strange as this idea is, I think actually sometimes we can see this around us. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you're sort of talking to a friend and the conversation seems to be going really, really well. And, they're interested in what you're saying. They seem to be engaged. You're enjoying one another's company. And then you think, you know what? I'm going to tell them about Jesus. Or I'm going to tell them what I did this weekend. I'm going to tell them that I went to church, that I believe in God. They're going to love it. And then you say it, and all of a sudden the conversation just dries up. Just stops dead. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it happens sometimes, at least to me. Why does that happen? Well, I think this verse tells us it's not because, you've told the gospel really boringly, although, sometimes we can be guilty of that. And nor is it that they can't mentally understand what you're saying. But Paul says it's because without the Spirit working in their life, there's no spiritual life in them. They have no desire to know God, no awareness of him. And so when you tell them the good news that Jesus died for them so that they could know God, as amazing as it is to you, to them it's just words. Because there's no spiritual life. Paul says that's how you were too. Before the Spirit worked in your life and breathed new life into you, that's how you were as well. Because we lived our lives doing what was wrong and failing to do what's right, we lived in a kind of death, physically alive but spiritually dead. And as Paul goes on to say, this meant that we were also under the wrath of God. He says that in verse 3. It says that we were by nature children of wrath. We were under God's holy anger against sin. I wonder if you ever really think about that. That before you heard about the cross and before you met Jesus and gave your life to him, that God was angry at your sin. That God saw you living the way you were and was offended by it. He hated it. He was angry against it. God had wrath towards your way of life. Now, just to be clear, there is a caveat to this that we're going to see in the next verse, and it's brilliant, and I can't wait to get to that verse, but I feel like we should just pause here for a moment, because this verse is no less true, that before we were forgiven by believing in Jesus, we were under the wrath of God. And I just want to be clear, when we speak about the wrath of God, we're not speaking about some sort of vengeful, vindictive, uncontrolled rage that God gets himself into for no reason. But we're talking about God's holy, just anger against sin. And that's a good thing. That's a good aspect of God. Just last night, me and Eliz were watching one of those sort of detective dramas, which gives you an insight into our Saturday night life. And it was the last one in a series, and it was the one where they catch the criminal finally and put them in prison. And when you see that in one of those sorts of shows, you kind of happy, because you think, yes, justice has been done. The evil has been punished. Wrong has been dealt with. And it's the same with God's wrath. It's a good thing, because it means that one day we will live in a world where all evil and all wrong is dealt with. God's wrath is good, but once we stood on the wrong side of it. Once God looked at our sin and had anger towards it. Again, I said these verses aren't pleasant to read, but they are true. And Paul says we need to hear them. But he doesn't stop there. And he doesn't say that's all we need to hear. He goes on to write, some more verses, and I think the first two words that he says are perhaps the most significant two words that have ever been written down. And if not that, they're one of the most, or two of the most significant words that have ever been written down. Two words that bring the most joy, bring the most hope, bring the most encouragement. I think sum up our whole lives, sum up the whole Bible. And what are they? It says this in verse 4. But God. But God. They're brilliant, aren't they? You were dead in your trespasses and sins. You were following the course of this world. You were by nature a child of wrath. You were destined for punishment for your sin. But God. I think those two words could sum up the whole Bible. You read this book, it's just an ongoing story of humans messing up time and time again, failing to do what's right, always doing what's wrong. But God intervenes. And if you're a Christian here this morning, these words also sum up your life too. Once you were living your own way, once you had no awareness of your Creator, once all you had in life was just what was going on with you, you had no hope of eternal life, but then God intervened. I feel like we could spend the rest of the morning just singing about these two words, but I would like us to move forward because I want to see what God did. And so we've seen who we were before we met God, and now Paul goes on to describe what God has done for us in light of that. And he says this, verse 4 goes on to say, but God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses. This is that caveat that I was talking about earlier. This amazing truth that, get this, even while God was angry with you, he loved you even more. Even while he looked at your sin and was offended, felt indignation, he also looked at you and felt mercy. He also looked at you and loved you with a great love. Even while you were dead in your trespass, he loved you with a great love that you couldn't even believe. I find that mind-boggling, don't you? That God could feel both of those emotions so passionately. Feel anger towards our sin, but also feel, I was going to say wrath again. But he also feels love and mercy towards us too. And the brilliant thing about these verses is that God didn't just look on us before we knew him and feel love and feel mercy, but actually God chose to act on his mercy as well. The rich mercy that he felt towards us led him to perform the greatest action of love that this world has ever known. It's one that we've been singing about already, one that we celebrate each week, one that many of us here know, is this, that God, instead of punishing us for our sin, instead of holding us to account for what we'd done wrong, he chose to send his son instead. Sent his son, who he loved, to die for us. You know, when Jesus died on the cross, he was dying in your place. He was dying to take your sin on his shoulders, dying to bear the wrath that you deserved. And it's true that Jesus went willingly to the cross. This was something he decided to do. But it wasn't that Jesus was just acting on his own when he went to the cross. It wasn't like it was just his idea, as if he really loved people and so he thought he'd die for them so that the angry God in heaven could be pacified, who didn't really like humans but would, put up with them because of what Jesus has done. This verse tells us that's not the case at all. The whole reason Jesus went to the cross willingly was because of the Father's mercy towards you, because of the Father's love towards you. Yes, he was angry at your sin, but by sending Jesus to die for it, he made a way that he could relate to you instead with mercy and love. Jesus died for us, taking our sin so that we could be forgiven and could walk free. And actually not just that either. Jesus died so that we could be forgiven, but he also rose again 3 days later. And that was also that we could receive new life with him. That we who were dead in our trespasses and sins could instead live new life. It's what it goes on to say in verse 5. It says that God made us alive together with Christ. If you are a Christian here this morning, when you put your trust in Jesus, you passed from death to life. We no longer walk through this world on our own, with no awareness of God, no awareness of our Creator. We now walk through it with him by our side. We now walk through it knowing what this world is all about, sort of having this new dimension to life where we're aware of this God who created us, and not just aware of him, but we have a relationship with him. We've been made alive. We've been given this new life. And what did we do to deserve it? What did we do to earn it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We've been forgiven and given new life, not because of what we deserved, but just because God is gracious. He gave it to us as a gift, a free gift. It's what we mean when we talk about grace here at church. Grace is God's undeserved kindness towards us, even though we don't deserve it. Even in spite of all we've done, he's kind to us. He's gracious to us. And this is what separates Christianity from every other religion. You know, every other religion will tell you, this is what you must do to earn favour with God. These are the standards you must meet in order to earn God's love. Christianity says the exact opposite. It says this is what God has done for you to earn you favour with him. This is what he's done for you because of his great love for you. You didn't deserve any of it, but he's given it to you anyway. What did we deserve? We deserved wrath. Instead, he's given us mercy. We deserved death. He's given us life. We deserved separation from him. And instead, he's given us adoption. It's all because of grace. It's amazing grace. Someone should write a song about that or something. It's brilliant news. And I just want us to be clear, this is how we relate to God now, okay? This is how you stand before God. You no longer have to fear condemnation. You no longer have to fear wrath or anger. All of that has been dealt with. Now you stand before God as his beloved child. He relates to you by grace. It's like what Renee shared earlier. You have a heavenly Father who knows what you've done wrong, who knows what you continue to struggle with, and yet still pours his kindness on you, still loves you, still desires to have a relationship with you. You know, when you woke up this morning, after being asleep for 8 hours and not moving at all, not doing anything to please God, you know what he felt towards you? He just felt love and compassion. Even though you'd done nothing, he just cherishes you. You say, I don't deserve that. I don't deserve that kind of grace. Of course you don't. It's all grace. It's all love. He gives it to us for free. And as I said at the start, this is one of the truths that we passionately believe as Ascot Life Church. We love it. We love to celebrate it. We want it to characterize everything we do. And so just before we finish and the band comes to join me, I just want to share 2 ways in which this can characterize our life as church. Because if we really believe this truth, we also want to live it out, don't we? And so I think there's 2 things that we can do with this truth. Firstly, we can show grace to one another. Because we've been forgiven by God of so much, let's get good at forgiving one another too. Let's get good at showing that grace to others around us. And particularly, let's get good at showing grace to those who are, not Christians, who are just coming in to check us out and to check out Christianity. God puts no barriers on those who can come to know him. He gave you life even when you were dead. His grace can reach to the furthest ends of the earth. There's no one who could walk in that door at the back and would be beyond God's grace. He can deal do amazing things with every single life. And so we also want to be a church that welcomes everyone, where everyone can come in and find about God and meet Jesus and be transformed by him. One of the phrases we have as a church is "come as you are." For that reason, if God welcomes all, we want to welcome all too. But the second thing I think we can do with this grace is also live in that grace ourselves. Because the end of that phrase goes on to say, "come as you are, but don't stay that way." And that's because grace, when you truly understand it, has this power to work in you, has this power to give you new life, has this power to transform your life and make you more like Jesus. That's how big God's grace is. It doesn't stop with your forgiveness, doesn't stop at removing your sin, but keeps on working in you so that you can live new life. And so in the same way that there's no person who could walk into this room and be beyond God's grace, there's also no area of your life that is beyond his grace either. No sin that you're struggling with now that his grace can't deal with. There's no issue in your family or in your workplace or in your marriage that his grace can't restore. Nothing going on in your life that his grace can't meet and heal. So we also want to live in grace, believe in its power to transform our lives and transform the world around us. And so just as the band come up and join me, I want us to end this morning by celebrating God's grace and enjoying it for ourselves by singing. But before we do that, I just want to leave you with a question which we'll have a bit of time to think about. And that question is this: where in your life are you limiting God's grace? Maybe there's a person who you know that doesn't know Jesus, and deep down you think, surely they'd never give their life to Jesus. Surely God would never forgive them. Of course he would. His grace is bigger than you know. Maybe there's something going on in your heart which you think, surely God couldn't deal with that. Surely he couldn't heal that. Of course he could. His grace does more than we could ever ask or imagine. Or maybe you're thinking about what I shared earlier, that we feel that God has more for us as a church. You think, surely God wouldn't bring 50 people to us to come and know Jesus and be baptized. Of course he could. His grace is that big. And so just as we enter into worship, I just want to take us, just to give us a few seconds, just while the band plays, just to think about that question. Where in your life might you be limiting God's grace? And then as we stand and sing, we can build our faith as we celebrate it, knowing that he is mighty to save and can do more than we could ask or imagine. Let me pray quickly.